We are in Nehemiah chapter 4. It's just a great story on how to handle discouragement. And I think that all of us have been discouraged at one time or another. I think all of us at one point has had a pity party. I know that when I throw a pity party, I can throw one of the best pity parties of all. I can throw great pity parties. And Nehemiah chapter 4 is a great story on how to handle discouragement when you're down, when you're out, when you're frustrated. How do you handle that? And that's what we're going to look at in Nehemiah chapter 4. And we just want to start out with the question, have you ever been discouraged? And I think all of us have it at some time. Some of us have been discouraged many, many times. And I just think that's common. And so we always start here with what does the Bible say? In the first section here, we just want to get kind of an overview. Last week we were in chapter 1 and 2. And in chapter 3, just a cursory reading of chapter 3, they started building the walls around Jerusalem. As we dealt with in last week, Nehemiah has come. They have built the temple in Jerusalem, and yet the walls haven't been built. And because there's no walls, Jerusalem is kind of a laughing stock. Nobody takes them serious there. That they got a temple, they can pray, but nobody takes the Jews seriously. And so Nehemiah has come. He's come with the king's blessing to build the walls. And so in chapter 3, they started building the walls. And then we find in verse 6 of chapter 4, we find where they're at. And I think this is fascinating. It says this, "At last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm." So the walls are halfway built. They're halfway done. And because we're going to deal with discouragement, when do you normally get discouraged? Basically when you're halfway done with something. You know, you're going to paint a room, right? And you get halfway done. I've got a swim spa. And I thought, you know what? I need to empty it of all of its water this past weekend. And I need to clean it from top to bottom. And it was a great idea till I got halfway done. And I thought, this is a dumb idea. It was pretty clean before I started. I didn't need to do all this work. And the more I got involved, the harder it got, and the more sore I got, and getting in and out of that thing and over again. I wish I hadn't started. But, you know, it's when you get halfway done of any project, that's when you get frustrated and you get discouraged. And you go, man, I wish I hadn't started. And that's where they are. They are halfway done building the walls around Jerusalem. And so in a little bit, we're going to look more at discouragement. And remember this verse. They're halfway done, okay? So now let's look at some of the players here that are kind of mocking. And remember, the first question was, have you ever been mocked? Why do we always, you know, the first question always deals with something that's going to be dealt with. So we dealt with mocking. Why is that? So let's go on. Sanballat is the Horonite, and we find that in chapter 2, verse 10. He served in a position equal to the governor of Samaria, and he ruled from one of the towns in Beth Horon, a region of Moab, about 12 to 18 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And he appeared as the group's ringleader, opposing Nehemiah in the rebuilding efforts. And so he's not happy at all that Nehemiah has come and he's building the wall. There's three guys that are really against these guys, and they're leading the people. And Sanballat seems to be the head guy. And so these are the players in the story that are against Nehemiah. And we're going to read about these guys as we go on here. Tobiah is an Ammonite official. He was most likely the governor of Ammon. Ironically, his name was Jewish and meant Yahweh is good, suggesting his family intermarried and he descended from the same categorical ancestry as Nehemiah. All right, and so he's a Ammonite official. And then Geshem appears as a third ruthless figure who opposed the work. Archaeological evidence shows Geshem's name appeared on a silver vessel given to an Arabian goddess in the 5th century BC. Historically, Geshem and his sons were Arabian rulers of tribes who conquered Moab and Edom. He was a powerful opposing force as a leader of Arabs in the land. And we see in chapter 4, verse 7, of the Arabians that are mentioned. And so we have 3 different groups of people coming together, attacking Nehemiah. And these guys are the power players. They're in charge now, and they know that if the Jews get their walls up, the Jews will now become as powerful as they are, and they don't want them to get their power. And so they're not happy at all, and they're wanting these guys to fail. All right? So they're not happy at all about this. So the first 3 verses of chapter 4 read like this. Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. Now, Nehemiah is writing this in first person, and that's why he said, we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Sumerian army officers, what does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Now again, remember, they have built a temple. So they are offering sacrifices also while they're building this wall. Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, that stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it, just making jokes about it, right? So Sanballat and Tobiah are looking out for their personal interests at the expense of others, while Nehemiah is looking out for the interest of others. So that's a difference between them. Nehemiah was back in Persia. He comes all the way back to Jerusalem to build the walls because he cares about his home where the Jews came from. This is not benefiting him. And yet these guys are all concerned about the power grab in their area where they live, and they're only concerned about themselves. Now remember, we kind of get the lay of the land going all the way back to chapter 2, verse 10, when it says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of my arrival, talking about Nehemiah, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. They weren't happy at all that Nehemiah had come. And so we just want to ask this question. Are you concerned about others, or are you only concerned about yourself? As Christians, we should always be concerned about other people. And so that leads us to this next question. How do you tell if someone is a gossip / troublemaker or trying to help you? There's always someone, it seems like, I run into in the church that sometimes they seem to be looking like they're trying to help you, but really they're not. They're either gossiping or a troublemaker, trying to stir the pot. Or how do you tell the difference between that kind of person, or are they trying to really help you? Talk about that between yourself. for those of you who have been, sadly, in the church a long time, you kind of get the gist of where I'm going with this question. All right, talk about that in your hot spots. Here are 4 reasons why we become discouraged. 4 reasons why, and we see this in these verses here. 4 reasons why we become discouraged. And here's what the Bible has to say to us. Most of these are found right in one verse. One verse. It says, first part of verse 10, it says, "Then the people of Judah began to complain, the workers are getting tired." The workers are getting tired. And sometimes people will come to me and they're saying, you know, man, I'm getting discouraged, and maybe I need to recommit to the Lord. Maybe I just need to dedicate myself more to God. And I start listening to what's going on in their lives, and it's like, you know, that's not your issue. You need to just go home and get some sleep. You need to take a vacation, because one of the reasons we get discouraged is you're just tired. You know, sometimes we just get burnt out and we get tired. And sometimes you just need to take a rest, and you're doing too much. You can't be going all the time. And they're just tired. And it says, you know, as we just said in that verse there, they're just tired, they're fatigued. And sometimes we just need to get a vacation. We go on in that verse and it says, "And there is too much rubble to be moved." And what this verse means to me is that rubble in our life just represents frustrations. You know, you ever been painting a room and it seems like you got more paint on you than on the walls? Or you're cleaning something, and the more you're cleaning, it seems like you got more garbage and more stuff in front of you than, you know, in the garbage cans. And it's like, oh man, how am I going to get this? It just seems like it's getting more in the way than what you're trying to get done. Another way to look at this is, we're just getting frustrated. The rubble becomes frustrations. Another way to look at this would be like interruptions. You're trying to do something and you're trying to get it done, and these would be interruptions that are stopping you from getting what you're really trying to get done. The rubble is getting in the way. They're trying to build a wall, and as they're moving the rubble, there's so much rubble or old parts of the wall, they can't keep building because they got to keep moving the rubble. It's interruptions. And so sometimes you can't do anything in the sense of the rubble, but you can identify and understand that there is rubble. And so sometimes you just have to deal with it appropriately and go, I know that's there, and I just have to be more organized about how I handle the interruptions and handle the frustrations, all right? And then we go on to the third part of that verse 10. It says, we will never be able to build the wall by ourselves. They've lost sight of the finish line. And we would say, because we lose hope. We become frustrated because we've lost hope. They're having a pity party here. They have become discouraged because they've lost hope of what they thought they were going to do. They're tired. They've got all this rubble. They just think they can't get it done. And then we go to verse 11, and it says, meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they know what's happening, we will swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. And if you go down to verse 12, that I'll read in a moment, verse 12, it's the Jews that are near the enemy that is saying this. It's the Jews near the enemy. It's the ones that are closest to the enemy that's hearing the negativity, right? It's the ones that's closest to the end, right? And so We're afraid of failure. That's the fourth reason that we get discouraged, is when we're just afraid of failing because other people might be talking about it. You know, they started to do that and they couldn't finish. The Jews were going to build a wall. You know, they tried that once before and they couldn't finish. And look at them now. They're a bunch of losers. They're a bunch of failures, you know. And so they just failed. And so those are four reasons why people fail. So let's look at this question 3, and then we'll look at what Nehemiah did and what we can learn from that, what we can do when we get discouraged. So here's question 3. What actions and habits help prepare us for a spiritual battle? And a lot of times discouragement is a spiritual battle. So talk about that in your groups. What can we do? What can we do to prepare for a spiritual battle? All right, so how can we obey? So this is what Nehemiah did to fight the discouragement that was happening among the people. Now remember, the wall's half built. Half built, so Nehemiah had to operate quickly to get these people out of this frustration that they were, discouragement that they were having, because they were obviously tired, frustrated, and losing hope and losing sight of the finish line. So Nehemiah had to do something. And so here's what he did. First, he prayed. This is in verse 4. The first 3 verses is Sanballat and Tobiah mocking them. So the first thing Nehemiah does is he prays. Then I prayed, hear us, O God, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. And so first thing he does is go to the Lord in prayer. That's what we need to do. So when you are discouraged, when you are frustrated, first thing is go to God. Go to Him in prayer. The second thing we see is in verse 12, the Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again. Notice again and again. They were singing a song. It just didn't happen once. They came again and again. They will come from all directions and attack us. So here's what Nehemiah does in verse 13. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. Now, when you go to Jerusalem, the walls are not on level. Jerusalem is not built on level land. The way Jerusalem is, it's on a hilly land. And so the wall follows the landscape. And so obviously the wall, even if the wall is the same height, when the hilly landscape goes down, the wall goes down. And so what he does is he places armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard. Now look at this. By families armed with swords, spears, and bows. Notice how he puts them by families. Do not isolate, because that's what people do when they get discouraged, they isolate. He doesn't do that. He puts them with people who support you. When you are discouraged, the worst thing you can do is isolate. You need to be with people who support you. Who supports you? Families. People who support you is people who love you. And he knew that their families would support them. He knew that families would fight for each other. And so that's what he does. He puts them with families so they're there together. And so please, when you're discouraged, when you're frustrated, do not isolate. And that's one of the worst things that you can do is isolate yourself, all right? Now we go on. Another thing is, then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people, and I said to them, don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious. Remember your God is greater than your enemy. We need to always remember that our God is superior and stronger than anything that you and I will ever face. We have power through our God. And then the second part of verse 14, and he says, and fight for your brothers, your sons, and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And lastly, I want you to remember this. God has people that he wants you to influence. You know, a lie that people who commit suicide tell themselves is that people would be better off if they themselves were no longer around, that others would be better off without them. And that's one of the greatest lies that you can tell yourself. God has people that he wants you to influence. There are people he wants you to influence. And he mentions there, fight for your wives, for your sons, your daughters. Fight for these people. And so God has people he wants you to influence. He puts them there and with their families, and he says, you fight for these people. You influence these people. And I think that is important for us. And so when you're discouraged, when you're frustrated, remember our God is greater than any problem that we have. Remember that God wants to use you to influence others. Remember that you need to not isolate, and that there are people there that God wants you to be around people that support you. God wants to use you and not to give up. And always go to him in prayer when you're frustrated and discouraged. Don't give up. Don't ever give up. Always remember your church family is always there for you. Think about these things this week as you strive to become more like Christ, as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together.